So, recently, and by recently I mean at the time of writing this video, a channel by the name of Thorgy's Arcade put out an hour-long video about what the roster for a potential sequel to PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale could look like. And it inspired me to then borrow inspiration from Biffweed to try tackling a similar topic to a Smash clone that's more near and dear to my heart. I'm of course talking about Cartoon Network, Punch Time Explosion. I've been a huge fan of Cartoon Network ever since I was a kid, and still am even after a lot of their low points. I've also been a big fan of the Super Smash Bros. Series ever since being introduced to it with Brawl. So when I was a kid, hearing that there was a game like Smash except with Cartoon Network characters was like a dream come true. And I got the XL version of the game for consoles and played the shit out of it. Despite loving this game as a kid though, I never actually had any nostalgic memories with it, and looking back at it again without rose-tinted glasses, it wasn't hard to see why. The game's honestly not very good. It can still be fun under the right circumstances, but it's obvious this was made first and foremost to cash in on Smash's success while also not providing any reason to play it over Smash. Seriously, it's the exact same gameplay, except it feels like it's being held together with glue and strings. At least PlayStation All-Stars tried something to stand out from Smash. It didn't make the game any better, but at least it tried. However, a lack of uniqueness isn't the main reason why I think people don't look fondly upon this game. I think the main problem is just that the game had a blatant lack of polish. A part of me always likes to think about what this series could have been if this game had done better. Sadly, it's unlikely that's ever going to happen, as this game's developer, Papaya Studios, shut down shortly after this game's release. And their only games after this were two dancing games based on the hit Disney Channel sitcom, Shake It Up. But I've still been wondering, what if Cartoon Network out of the blue decided to pull all the stops and revive this game? Give it to a more talented and experienced studio that would give it the care and polish it needs and treat it like a collection of their shows, old and new? Well, I'm here to speculate on that. More specifically the characters and other fanservice-y stuff. Modes and other gameplay aspects are things I might touch upon later, but in terms of selling the game, especially when it's a crossover fighter, the characters are what's going to make or break it for a lot of people. Ergo, that seems like a good place to start with this discussion. Because Cartoon Network has gotten a lot of shows. A lot of shows that have become staples of the network that should absolutely be in this game. And also a few shows that are better off never being acknowledged for the rest of time. But don't worry, we're only focusing on the former. Before we get into the characters though, we first have to ask one simple question. The original Punch Time Explosion had a roster of 26 characters, which is 2 more than the amount of fighters in Smash Melee. I'm going to keep it simple and simply bump that number up by 10. So 36 characters for the base roster. Obviously more can be added with DLC, but I feel like that's a decent number of characters for a follow-up. It's not too little and not too many. Though if you think I'm simply putting 10 more characters onto the roster that already exists, then you're going to be disappointed. This isn't gonna be another everyone is here. While I do want to treat this roster like a sort of celebration of the new and old of Cartoon Network, I do think there are some characters that would be better off cut from the original roster. And just like Thorgy, I decided to go over every character from the original game and explain why a character is or isn't returning for this roster. Also, I just want to say up front that I decided the maximum number of representatives a show can have would be 4. Mainly because a lot of these shows have no shortage of good characters to pull from for characters to play as, but I didn't want to create an imbalance in the amount of fighters one series has compared to another. Now, with that out of the way, let's just jump right into it because some of these characters I'm gonna have a lot to say about. Obviously Ben is returning. Ben 10 is one of the most iconic series Cartoon Network has put out and it still has a die-hard fanbase to this day, so we're starting off with a no-brainer here. However, there is going to be a caveat to this. Normally when Ben 10 gets represented in anything, they base it off the most recent incarnation of the character, which for the first game was Ultimate Alien. And if we apply that logic to now, that obviously means Ben would have to be based on the reboot, which I know is pretty divisive. Personally I don't mind because I think the Ben 10 reboot is the best of the reboots we got around that time, even though I know that's really not saying much. Plus I wasn't really a fan of how Ben was handled in the original game. He just fought as himself and only transformed into his aliens for his special moves, which is just really boring and feels like a huge missed opportunity. I envision Ben as more of a Pokemon trainer type of character where he swaps between different alien forms with their own playstyles. So if changing Ben means we could get something more like that, then I'm all for it. Powerpuff Girls is a beloved classic Cartoon Network show, so obviously Buttercup will be returning, and just to knock them out of the way, Bubbles and Blossom will just as obviously be returning. You can't have one without the other two, simple as that. All of them take up their own slots just like the original game. I was going to do like I did with Ben and change them to be based on the reboot, but I decided against it. While 2016 Ben 10 is divisive but still popular enough to justify it, 2016 Powerpuff Girls is almost universally hated. And for good reason. Very good reason. So I think basing it off the classic series would be the safer bet. The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack is a show I don't really see people talking about aside from a few jokes from it or clamoring for more. The show also sort of just came and went and didn't really make much of a splash on the network. So you can't even argue it being that important of a show. As such, I'm cutting Flapjack. I'm sure the show has its fans, but I don't see there being enough outcry to justify bringing him back over anyone else or any new characters. Obviously everything I said about Flapjack also applies to Knuckles, so he's not coming back either. Kids Next Door isn't really relevant nowadays, but unlike Flapjack the show does have a pretty decent cult following. And there are still a lot of fans of the original show out there who are still hoping for something to come from that KND Galactic teaser animatic. Even though that seems pretty unlikely, I still decided to bring Nigel back for this game, simply because you need to include some cult classic characters, because those fans tend to eat up anything those characters are in. As long as it's good, of course. Which I'm hypothetically saying this game would be. Dexter's Laboratory is pretty much the staple classic Cartoon Network show. I know Jendi said he was pretty much done with the series, but it really feels like that if you were to make a game that's a collection of the best of Cartoon Network, Dexter absolutely needs to be there somewhere. He's another no-brainer to return.
Monkey!
Monkey comes from a side segment of Dexter's Lab called Dial M for Monkey. I know how I just said Dexter's was a show that absolutely needs to be represented in a big Cartoon Network crossover game like this. But honestly, I think we'd be fine with just Dexter himself for that. And even if I were to add a second rep, bringing back Monkey would not be my first choice. Nobody really talks about his segments aside from saying they want to bone Agent Honeydew. So he's getting cut. Grim Adventures is another cult classic show that a lot of people still love to this day, and all the actors are still active and I'm sure would be down to reprise their roles. So even though, again, it's not exactly relevant, I still decided to bring back the two main reps we got. And yes, I said two because I'm still having Billy and Mandy share a slot as our first duo character. Ideally this time around they'd have a moveset that better captures their personalities, maybe have Mandy do all the work while Billy is just Billy.
Destroy us all!
I'll take the chicken.
Destroy us all!
And now another no-brainer to return. Samurai Jack is a very popular and influential show for the network. The 5th season on Adult Swim was a huge hit even if it was divisive, and we recently this year got a full-scale action game based on the show. So clearly it's still relevant and the people behind the series still want to use Jack and stuff. And no, I don't see Jack being an Adult Swim series now being any kind of hindrance. 4/5 of the show still aired on Cartoon Network, and Season 5 was honestly pretty tame compared to what's usually on that block. Worst it got was blood and the funny robot man saying penis, but the tone was still mostly the same as the original seasons. So Jack is absolutely back for this. I wanted to bring back Captain Planet because it would be funny. And also because he did get a crossover appearance in OKKO, which, spoiler alert, is one of the new shows I'm representing in this game. He was kind of an odd surprise inclusion for the original game who basically served as the Sonic in their own subspace emissary. But the more I thought about it, I just couldn't think of many good reasons to bring him back other than him being a meme pick. And that's not a good enough reason for me to give him a slot over another, more deserving character. Hell, The show's not even that synonymous with Cartoon Network. It originally aired on TBS. So yeah, Captain Planet is getting cut. Even though we could probably all use some environmentalism right about now. If we're bringing back number 1 due to the show's cult classic status, then we might as well bring Father back too. He is the main villain after all and arguably the best villain from the show. Plus he had some of the best quotes in the original game.
My head is ring-a-ding-dinging.
Likewise, Vilgax is also returning, because as we already established, Ben 10 is a no-brainer to include. He's basically the big bad of the entire series, appearing in every show and always serving as the final opponent except for Omniverse. And the reboot, which is still ongoing. Speaking of which, just like Ben, Vilgax will also be based on the 2016 show now for consistency. But I don't think they'd need to change him much other than the fact that he no longer uses a sword. Maybe they could include alternate costumes of his designs from other shows. That would be pretty neat. And once again, Mojo Jojo is another no-brainer. If we're bringing in the Powerpuff Girls, then he absolutely needs to come back too, being their arch-nemesis and all. And just like the girls, he'll also be based on the classic show instead of the 2016 one. Because again, that show is just not worth representing. And now we're moving on to the characters that were featured in the XL version. Kevin is returning but with a big asterisk on that. Just like Ben and Vilgax, he's going to be based on the reboot, especially since he's become a more prominent character in the recent seasons. However, unlike Ben and Vilgax, Kevin is a completely different character in the reboot. Not so much in terms of personality, but instead of being a guy who can absorb materials onto his body, he's instead some kid who invented his own Omnitrix because it came to him in a dream. And before you ask, no, the show doesn't explain that. It's just kind of a thing that happened and now he's Ben's rival. So going with 2016 Kevin makes him technically both a returning but also new character. But then again I also suggested a major rework for Ben anyway. I also mentioned that Ben in the original game just fought as himself but turned into aliens for special, which was lame. But for Kevin, I want to apply that to him but extend it further to have various other attacks change him into other aliens. That way we would have two characters based around the same idea without being a full-on Echo Fighter or semi-clone. Now for a character that's much easier to discuss, Johnny Bravo is another staple classic Cartoon Network show like Dexter's Lab, and Johnny himself absolutely needs to return for this. I'm aware he'd be kind of a meme pick like Captain Planet, but one that I assume people actually wouldn't mind taking up a slot. The show still has a lot of fans today and holds up very well, especially given the premise of Johnny trying to get in bed with every woman he sees. Plus just picture all the funny interactions he'd have with some of the female characters that would inevitably lead to him getting his ass kicked. Now, as I said earlier, I only wanted to have 4 characters max per show, and by process of elimination you already know that means him is getting cut. Not because I don't enjoy his character, but simply because Mojo Jojo is considered the main villain, so he would obviously take priority over him. Thankfully, Powerpuff Girls is the only show in the original game that exceeded 4 characters, so this is the first and last decision like this that I'll have to make. Classic Ben I could see them including just for nostalgia's sake, but since we're basing the main Ben on the 2016 show, where he can basically do everything original Ben can and more, and how reboot Kevin is also already similar to Ben, I really don't think we need 3 characters based around the same idea. So classic Ben is getting cut too. The Scotsman is another character I debated about whether or not to bring him back. Sure, he's a popular character, but in the grand scheme of things he's not really that prominent. He only appeared in like 3 episodes of the original 4 seasons, and Adult Swim bumped that up to a whopping 5. That's out of 100 episodes combined. But with that said, I just couldn't help myself. A lot of people just love this big lummox, myself included. Sure, he's not an especially prominent character, but he has a huge personality, which is important in a big crossover fighter like this. He's a character I feel a lot of people would miss if he didn't return, so he's safe. I can't really say the same for Haas Delgado, however. I do like this guy and I'm sure he has his fans, but he never really struck me as that popular of a character. At least, not one that people were really clamoring for to be playable from the original 3DS game. Honestly, I think that Grim, Billy and Mandy are more than enough to represent their own show without help from a random side character. So sorry Hoss, but you're not making the cut. No, the Toiltnator is not returning either. I honestly have no idea what compelled them to put him into XL. If they really needed to put in another KND rep, there were dozens of better options than literally the show's equivalent of the Condiment King.
Conceptual Condiment King! Come, Batman. Let's see if you can cut the mustard. Quiet!
And finally, we're at the Shogun of Sorrow, Aku. Now, you'd think that with everything I said about Samurai Jack and even the Scotsman, plus the other main villains that are returning, that Aku would yet again be a no-brainer to return. And initially, I agreed with that. But after thinking about it for a while, I actually decided that Aku won't be returning. Or rather, not as a playable character. Because obviously, he needs to be there if we're representing Samurai Jack. So why am I not bringing him back as a fighter? Because to put it simply, seeing Aku in playable form in XL just feels weird to me. I feel like the main appeal of Aku is that he manages to balance out being comedic with also being this massive, ominous demon that literally towers over the world. Sure, Aku can shapeshift and change his size, so he absolutely could work as playable in this game. But to me, shrinking him down to fit the troll kind of removes a key part of what makes him so imposing in the first place. I'm aware that this is starting to sound like a Ridley is too big deal, but with Ridley, his size isn't what makes him such a threat. It helps, but it's more so that he's just a savage murderous space dragon that shows no mercy, which isn't something he needs to be huge for to get across. This is more like if you have Godzilla in a game, but you shrink him down to the size of a regular person. Sure, it still works, but it kind of defeats the purpose of having a character like Godzilla in your game in the first place. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but I don't know, Aku as a playable fighter just doesn't feel right to me. He's a lot better suited as a boss. Maybe an assist. Or both, like Rathalos. So, we've talked about a lot in this video, but I'm sure you've probably noticed that there were two characters from the game that I failed to bring up. Or I guess four to be more accurate. Billy and Mandy were the only duo characters I went over. But PTE actually had two more. Those being Chowder and Kimchi, and Mac and Blue from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. You're probably wondering why I didn't talk about them. And to put it simply, it's because I simply couldn't decide which duo I wanted to bring back for this over the other. Both have solid reasons for them to or not to return. And sure, I could just bring both of them back, and I admit there's no reason not to. But for the purposes of my own roster, I don't want to have an odd number for both veterans and newcomers, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what new characters to include, and I don't really want to cut one of them either. I know that's mostly my own OCD talking, but that's just how I personally feel about the matter. So, I decided I would make a straw poll and leave it in the description of the video for you guys to vote on which of these two to come back. Simple as that. But regardless, that leaves us with 16 returning characters out of the original roster's 26, which is a pretty solid lineup. And it means the majority of characters here are going to be new, as we have to fill up the rest to reach that 36 character goal. So join us in the next video where we'll talk about the new characters I've chosen, and also announce the winner of that poll I brought up. Until then, Adam is out. Peace.